Nobody wants to be insulin resistant these days because everybody's freaking out about type 2 diabetes, which they really should be. So in this video, I'm going to share 5 really common mistakes that can push a person more insulin resistant. Let's jump in.
TC Hale is not a doctor and does not claim to be a doctor or licensed in any type of medical field. Don't be an idiot and use anything heard on the show as medical advice. This information should be used for educational purposes only, and you should contact your doctor for any medical advice. Now get off me.
Now, a lot of you are already going to know this first mistake, but it happens to be the most common mistake, and you'd really be surprised at how many people don't understand that constantly spiking blood sugar and insulin can be a big problem. And the reason is because we've known this for decades, but it can take 30 or 40 years for new science to make it to the mainstream, to where everybody understands and they're no longer listening to the bad advice that was handed out by the government 40 years ago. So look at it this way. If a person goes to the hospital because they're dealing with major pain, the doctor may put them on some morphine, and that morphine can relieve that pain. And then the longer the person needs to use morphine to reduce the pain that they're having, then the higher the dose the doctor may need to use, because the cells start to become less receptive to that morphine. So now, to get the same response, they have to increase the amount of morphine that the person is using. And the longer that they continue to increase this dose, the less and less the cells are receptive to that morphine. And eventually the morphine will have no effect on the person's pain whatsoever. So this is how insulin works. If a person is eating carbohydrates, when we eat those carbohydrates or starches or sugars, the body makes insulin to help us sweep that glucose into the bloodstream so the glucose can be used properly. But if that insulin is high all the time, every day, all day long, then the cells eventually will become less receptive to that insulin, just like the cells became less receptive to the morphine. So when the cells are less receptive to the insulin, then this glucose starts to accumulate in the bloodstream, and the body's like, oh, well, I guess I just need to make more insulin. So the body starts to make a higher level of insulin to do the same job that a smaller amount of insulin did before. So now this higher amount of insulin is getting the job done, but it's doing so by screaming at the cells all day with this really high insulin level. One of the problems is that it takes a lot longer for insulin to come down than it takes for blood sugar to come down. So blood sugar may come down in an hour or two, as to where insulin may take 4, 5, 6 hours to come down to a lower level. So the person has this high insulin all day long, every day, because the person continues to eat more and more carbohydrates at every meal and spike insulin back up high even before it comes down. And the cells start to become less receptive to that insulin. Now, there's a lot of factors that can magnify this problem. A lot of the junk and processed carbohydrates and processed junk food that we're eating today is not the same junk that we were eating 40 years ago. You know, everything had sugar in it before, but now it's got this high fructose corn syrup and all these artificial sweeteners and all these toxic junk that can really magnify the effects on the body and almost make it seem like they're eating some kind of turbo sugar. It's not like the sugar that we had 40 years ago. This stuff is on crack. This stuff is turbocharged. And these same junk foods from the same companies that we ate 40 years ago now can cause a person's blood sugar to spike much higher and make that insulin spike a lot higher too. So that's one factor that can be a really big deal. Another factor can be that there can be imbalances in the body that make insulin a little bit less effective for some people. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But if there's a problem making the insulin less effective, then the body's going to make more of that insulin to do the same job, and then those higher levels of insulin are going to scream at the cells all day long, and eventually the cells will be less receptive to that insulin. So you really can't judge the amount of carbohydrates that you should be eating according to what your Aunt Peggy is eating. She may be processing carbohydrates and sugars very efficiently, where your body may not be doing so. Your body may need to produce a lot more insulin than Aunt Peggy needs to process the same amount of carbohydrates. And if that's the case, then you have a fast track to becoming insulin resistant. So to correct this problem, we really want to reduce the level of carbohydrates, sugars, and especially liquid sugars like alcohol or soda and all that kind of garbage that we're consuming. We need to reduce what we're consuming so that we're not spiking insulin so high all day long. So maybe we continue to eat some carbohydrates, but we try to consume more real food sources of those carbohydrates, things that we call medium carb foods that have a level of carbohydrates that give you the carbs that you need to function, but not such high levels that you create this huge spike in blood sugar that follows with a huge spike in insulin levels. So foods like, butternut squash and yams and Brussels sprouts and, all these things that are real foods that contain carbohydrates in them. The next thing we can learn to do is learn to cycle carbohydrates. Maybe you don't have high carbohydrate foods at every single meal every single day. Maybe you just have one meal in the day that has those carbohydrates in it, and maybe lunch and dinner just have like proteins and fats and green vegetables. Because while we're sleeping, that gives us time for insulin to really come down so the body can access stored fat and burn that for fuel, and the cells can be more receptive to insulin when it goes up again, since insulin's not high all day and all night, screaming at the cells the whole time. If we can extend that window by either not eating carbohydrates or sugars for breakfast and lunch, or don't eat them for lunch and dinner. That way you're extending that window of time where insulin comes down while you're sleeping. This can be a great way to allow the cells to become more responsive to insulin without having to totally drop carbohydrates and sugars from your diet altogether. Now, mistake number 2 is living with digestive symptoms. Now, digestive symptoms alone are not actually going to directly cause insulin resistance, but they do have the ability to change your behavior, and that can be a really big problem for insulin resistance. So when we eat food, our stomachs make hydrochloric acid, or HCl, and this is meant to start helping us break that food down. And then once that food is properly acidified in the stomach, it'll leave the stomach and go into the duodenum, where the gallbladder will squirt this alkaline bile down onto that acidic product. So when this alkaline bile meets the acidic product from the stomach, it creates a sizzle. And that sizzle helps us really bust all that food apart and pull all the nutrients out of that food. So here's the problem. It's really common today for someone not to be making enough stomach acid. And it's also really common for someone's bile to become too thick and sticky to flow correctly. So if either side of digestion is not working correctly, we don't get that sizzle, and we don't really bust the food apart and pull all those nutrients out of that food. The other problem is that when either side of digestion isn't working correctly, we're going to get digestive symptoms. Things like burping and bloating, or acid reflux, or constipation, or diarrhea, or even nausea, or skin issues like acne and other skin problems. So when you're experiencing any of these symptoms, that's a really strong sign that digestion is not working the way that it should, and you're not breaking down your food the way that you should. So if you're going to eat a steak and you're going to feel lousy for the next 8 hours, then that's going to cause you to gravitate away from eating these types of proteins and more towards eating simple processed carbohydrates. These processed junk carbohydrates are really easy to break down and turn into fuel. So if a person's digestion can't break down proteins correctly, or maybe they can't emulsify or break down their dietary fats and use those fats correctly, well, then they're going to feel lousy, as those types of foods break down by rotting and fermenting. And that rotting and fermenting is creating all these gases and trouble and symptoms. And so the person will start gravitating away from that and just go to, that Pop-Tart was easy to digest, I'll have another Pop-Tart. And they start gravitating more towards more processed carbohydrates and high starch, high carbohydrate foods that are going to spike blood sugar and then keep insulin high all day long as they continue to eat more and more of these foods. So if a person can't get fuel from proteins or fats, they're going to keep eating all this junk, and it's eventually going to lead to insulin resistance. So if you're dealing with any digestive issues, you really need to correct those digestive malfunctions so that you can eat proteins and vegetables and fats for a meal and feel great after that. You can actually get fuel from that. So if you're dealing with any digestive symptoms at all, my book, Kick Your Fat in the Nuts, will walk you through figuring out which aspects of digestion aren't working correctly, and if they're not, what steps can you take to correct those? And the book is available on Amazon, but in the description below this video, I'm going to give you a link to get the whole book totally for free. So that book will walk you through how to fix those steps, and then you can start moving towards cycling your carbohydrates and having meals without any carbohydrates and doing things that will allow your insulin to come down so that the cells can become more receptive to that insulin. Okay, mistake number 3 is going to freak some of you out, and some of you are going to hate this. You're going to want to yell at me in the comments. That's fine. You can yell at me in the comments. It's a good time. But the big mistake that is really common is taking too many omega-3 fatty acid supplements. This can be a really big problem. Now, to understand that insulin resistance can exist, there has to be an issue in the opposite direction that can exist as well. And we view hypoglycemia almost as the opposite of insulin resistance. A person is eating carbohydrates, starches, or sugars, and their insulin is processing those carbohydrates too aggressively. And it creates that sugar crash where they have all the symptoms of the hypoglycemic type symptoms. So the problem is that to understand how this works is that we use omega-3 fatty acid supplements to correct hypoglycemia. And it works great. It works unbelievably well. So we're using these supplements to push a person more insulin resistant. We're using it to make those cells less receptive to the insulin so the insulin isn't some big bully and is going to push all the blood sugar out of the bloodstream too quickly, too hard. So this works really great. And we understand that everybody in the medical world is all saying, oh, take all these omega-3. All the type 2 diabetics should be taking pounds of omega-3 supplements because they're anti-inflammatory. It's a really big mistake. They are anti-inflammatory in a petri dish. But as they push a person more insulin resistant, the body's going to make more and more insulin, and that higher level of insulin is going to become inflammatory. So it works in a horrible way. It's not something that you want to be doing. Now, we do use omega-3 fatty acids for the right situation, where a person is too hypoglycemic, or maybe they're dealing with what we call an anabolic imbalance. We'll get to that in just a second. These fatty acids are great at correcting those issues. That's why you hear so many benefits from people taking these supplements. But because they're good for one situation, doesn't mean they're magic. These are not leprechaun beans. They're not going to fix every single thing, and they actually make some issues, like insulin resistance, much worse. If you want to learn more about that, watch our video on who should not be using omega-3 fatty acids, and that'll give you some more insights. You can also look into the work of Ray Peat and Guy Schenker. They explain the situation a lot deeper than we'll cover here in this video, but this is a really big problem and it's really common. Step number 4 is too many seed oils or vegetable oils. This is a really big problem, and we've known for about 20 years or more through science that these oils are not fit for consumption. But again, it takes 40 years to get this information in the mainstream, so you may not know this yet. You may be chugging down all the Crisco and all the vegetable oils and thinking that you're doing the right thing, since they told us, long ago that all this butter and lard was going to kill us, and we need to switch to these vegetable oils that are heart healthy. So if you're still in that camp, it's a horrible camp to be in. You want to get out of that camp as soon as possible, because the inflammatory response that these oils can create can mess with the receptors for insulin and make a person more insulin resistant. And the problem is that these oils are everywhere. They're in all the processed foods. You cannot hide from them. If you buy a Toyota Corolla, it's got vegetable oil in there. So it's really hard to get away from these oils unless you're eating real food that you're cooking at home. Most restaurants are going to fry all their food in these horrible vegetable oils. And even worse is somebody's like, oh, I'm eating healthy, I just had a salad. But their salad dressing is loaded with these vegetable and seed oils that are all pro-inflammation. So they're very inflammatory and creating a lot of problem and affecting your cell's ability to be receptive to insulin and pushing you more towards insulin resistance. So here's a test that you can do. You can take your vegetable oil at home and you can put it in your trash can and just see what it looks like there. If it looks okay, you might want to leave it in your trash can. You might want to not ever buy it again, ever. It's a big problem. Get away from these oils. Run as fast as you can. Go back to eating real food fats like butter and coconut oil and animal fats, even lard and bacon grease. All these things are better for you than these processed oils that go through like 17 different steps to become processed so that they can be, at least look like they can be consumed by humans. They're all chemically processed. It's a real problematic situation. Get away from them. And to cover the 5th common mistake, we're going to have to get a little bit sciencey here for just a second, but it's living with what we call a catabolic imbalance. Now, Dr. Emmanuel Rivisi helped us understand that the body has a natural circadian rhythm at the cellular level. So during the day, our body should be in a more catabolic state where the cells are very good at creating energy and breaking down tissues so that those tissues can be rebuilt. And during the night, our body should move into a more anabolic state where the body is very good at resting and rebuilding and repairing tissues so the body can be renewed. So both states are appropriate. The problem is some people can get stuck in one of these states most of the time, and they cannot move back and forth the way that the body should each day. So if a body is stuck in this catabolic state most of the time, we seem to see where the urine pH will go a lot lower, and in that state, it appears that insulin becomes less effective. Now, this is not causative. The low urine pH is not causing this. This is just a correlation that we see. So when the urine pH is very low, if the insulin is not as effective, then the body will need to make more insulin to do the same amount of job that a smaller amount would have done before. So the more insulin the body needs to make, then that insulin is going to stay high a lot longer. It's going to be screaming at the cells all day long, and then the cells are going to become less receptive to that insulin. So this is why a lot of people lead towards that insulin resistance. When we're looking at the body chemistry of most type 2 diabetics, we're seeing that they seem to lean towards this catabolic state and have a lower urine pH. So we want to learn to look at our unique bioindividuality and look at our own body chemistry, and we can do this with simple tests that we can do at home using tools you can pick up at a pharmacy or a health food store. And when you understand what imbalances are creating problems with your body, then you can just take nutritional and lifestyle choices and move those steps in the right direction to correct those imbalances. So that book that I told you how to get for free in the description below will walk you through those simple self-tests and help you figure out if you're leaning too far on that catabolic side. If you seem to be approaching insulin resistance or your fasting blood sugar is over 100 and you're showing signs of moving towards insulin resistance, you really want to see, is this imbalance part of the problem that's pushing you towards that situation? You can also watch our video on understanding a catabolic imbalance to get more insights there. And if you hate to read, we have a totally free digestion course that'll walk you through those same steps, and we'll put the link to that free course or the free book in the description below this video. Now, there are other causes for insulin resistance, but those seem to be the 5 most common causes for most people. To gain other insights into health issues that may surprise you, check out our video on 5 steps that could be trashing your liver. I can't wait to hear about your results.